Hello and welcome. I'm James Azimoha and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. A plan to bring commercial shipping back to the Strait of Hormuz. Iran and Oman say they have an agreement in principle. Ukraine appeals to its backers for more military support as the supply of missile interceptors drop by over half. And Georgia suffers its third nationwide blackout in 2 weeks. Opposition groups say sabotage can't be ruled out. Now let's start in the Middle East. Iran and Oman say they have agreed in principle on a proposed shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. The plan could pave the way for commercial traffic to resume through the vital energy corridor, but key details have yet to be announced.
Iran says it's reached an agreement in principle with Oman on a proposed shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz. It marks a potential step toward restoring commercial traffic through one of the world's most important energy corridors. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said Tehran and Muscat have agreed on the route's geographical coordinates and are finalizing a joint statement covering technical, legal, security and environmental aspects. A senior Iranian diplomat said the two sides reached preliminary agreement on nearly all key issues, including entry and exit routes, after more than 3 weeks of consultations. Under the proposal, the current temporary northern and southern shipping lanes would be replaced by a single route through Iran's territorial waters for 2 to 4 months, while talks continue on a long-term arrangement. Baghaei, however, said the agreement alone would not guarantee safe navigation, claiming that U.S. military activity and the naval blockade of Iranian ports remain security concerns. The announcement follows weeks of Omani-led mediation, while U.S. President Donald Trump says negotiations are making progress and that talks seem to be working out quite well. Tehran continues to deny direct talks with Washington, saying discussions are taking place only through Oman. Meanwhile, Tehran has warned Gulf states that any renewed U.S. strikes could lead to retaliation against American assets and energy infrastructure across the region, urging countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to help prevent further escalation. The Strait of Hormuz carries around 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments, making its reopening crucial for international energy markets.
And the diplomatic push over Hormuz is widening. Iran and Italy have exchanged updates on negotiations over the strait. Tehran says while an agreement with Oman is close, the waterway will not immediately be opened. Turash Shibelilo has more.
Iran and Italy have briefed each other about the latest negotiations between Tehran and Muscat on the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, as well as talks in Rome about Lebanon and Israel for a comprehensive ceasefire agreement, according to the state IRNA news agency. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and his Italian counterpart, Antonio Tajani, spoke to each other on phone on Wednesday. A Foreign Ministry press release said that the two top diplomats said they supported diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions. Meantime, Deputy Foreign Minister for Legal Affairs Kazem Gharibabadi said that Iran and Oman are near to finalizing a deal on new shipping arrangements at the Strait of Hormuz. However, he stressed that the agreement would not lead to an immediate or complete reopening of the strategic waterway connecting the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. He added, the understanding with Oman does not mean implementing Clause 5 of the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding between Iran and the United States. Also, in another related development, a spokesman for the National Security and Foreign Policy Commission of the Parliament, Hassan Qashqavi, stressed that the situation in the strait will not return to pre-war conditions. The lawmaker was quoted by the Parliament news agency as saying that Iran will not accept the US-imposed Southern Corridor because it fails to ensure Iran's national interests. amid renewed hopes of de-escalation. Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baqai said that neither Foreign Minister Araghchi nor Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baqir Ghalibaf are scheduled to visit Pakistan or Qatar for mediated talks with the US. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Now, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has accused the United States and Israel of plotting a rapid takeover of the country within 24 or 48 hours rather. Speaking in a national address, Iranian president accused Washington and Tel Aviv of seeking to weaken Iran and create divisions. He said that despite recent challenges, Iran remains a strong and respected country. The remarks come as Tehran and Washington continue discussions over the future of the Strait of Hormuz. Now staying in the Middle East, because talks in Rome have failed to prevent another escalation in the violence in Lebanon. Israel has renewed strikes in the south of the country, saying it's taken action after ceasefire violations by Hezbollah. Lebanese authorities report 1 person killed and a dozen wounded.
Ongoing diplomatic efforts between Israel and Lebanon gave way to renewed military action on Wednesday after Israel launched targeted strikes in southern Lebanon. Tel Aviv says they were in response to what it described as a Hezbollah violation. Authorities confirm 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. The Lebanese Health Ministry says 1 person died and 12 others wounded in the attack in the southern town of Tibnin. Before the operation, the Israeli military issued its first online evacuation warning in more than a month, telling residents of the village of Mansouri, about 25 kilometers from Tibnin, to leave. It said it would act against the Iran-backed group in the area. Video from social media showed plumes of smoke rising over Mansouri after the strikes. Reuters verified the location using satellite imagery and topographical features, while NASA detected thermal activity in the area on the day of the operation. The strikes came a day after the latest round of US-facilitated talks in Rome, where technical delegations from Israel and Lebanon resumed discussions aimed at advancing security arrangements along their border. The United Nations says the evacuation order for Mansouri is the first displacement order issued by the Israeli military since the latest ceasefire announcement on the 19th of June.
This new order comes as displaced families have been cautiously making their way back to their homes in southern Lebanon in recent weeks, underscoring how fragile the situation remains and the uncertainty that people continue to face. Hostilities continue to affect civilians in southern Lebanon.
According to the United Nations, around 1,500 people were living in the village at the end of July. It says families who had only recently begun returning home now face renewed uncertainty as shelling, demolition operations and other military activity continue to damage homes, farmland and civilian infrastructure.
All right, after the break, Ukraine appeals to its backers for more military support as the supply of missile interceptors drops by over half. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now, Russian strikes across eastern Ukraine have killed 6 people overnight, according to local authorities. Rescue teams worked to extinguish fires and clear debris after homes were hit in the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. Also, a Russian attack damaged a foreign-flagged cargo ship carrying wheat in the Black Sea, killing 1 crew member and sparking a fire, according to officials. Ukraine's seaports authorities said the vessel, the Mera Queen, sailing under the flag of Guinea-Bissau, was hit late on Wednesday. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces struck 2 oil refineries deep inside Russia, President Volodymyr Zelensky said, without providing further details. And Ukraine says its ability to defend against such attacks is shrinking. It says the supply of anti-ballistic missile interceptors has fallen significantly on last year. President Zelensky highlighted the shortage after Russia launched 24 ballistic missiles that Kyiv failed to stop from landing.
Ukraine received only a third of anti-ballistic missile interceptors in 2026 as it did in 2025, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky on Wednesday. The scale of the shortage was underlined the same day when Ukraine failed to intercept 24 ballistic missiles launched by Russia.
Since the beginning of 2026, Ukraine started receiving about, and it's important that Anatoly Mykolaievich is here, he will confirm this, the head of the Air Force, Ukraine started receiving just a third of the anti-ballistic missiles.
During a Wednesday meeting with Britain's Defence Secretary Wes Streeting in Kyiv, Zelensky warned that Moscow was likely to expand its ballistic missile production.
That they don't want to stop, and I think that they want to continue and to, increase escalation, yes, using the ballistic missiles. And we have our estimation, I want to share with you, we have an estimation that they will increase the production of such ballistic missiles.
Zelensky also spoke with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte on Wednesday about obtaining more interceptors from countries with missiles available for transfer. He called for bureaucratic obstacles to be removed, while Rutte said he was discussing Ukraine's urgent air defense needs with NATO allies. Meanwhile, the United States is continuing talks on allowing Ukraine to manufacture Patriot PAC-3 interceptors, despite President Donald Trump casting doubt on such an agreement last week. Options under consideration include producing components in Ukraine for final assembly in Germany, adding Kyiv to an existing American-European program, or allowing it to manufacture a cheaper PAC-3 variant. However, even if an agreement is reached, the first missiles are unlikely to become available for at least a year, leaving Ukraine dependent on immediate transfers from Allied stockpiles.
And Kyiv is strengthening its defenses at home. Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council has approved a resilience plan for Kyiv aimed at preparing the capital for possible threats during the autumn-winter season. During a meeting chaired by President Zelensky, officials reviewed the implementation progress of resilience plans for individual regions and cities. The aim is to protect critical infrastructure, expand shelter capacity, and strengthen air defenses. The move marks or comes as Ukraine prepares for possible Russian strikes on energy facilities. As the autumn approaches, Ukraine is calling on allies to bolster its air defenses. Kyiv says critical Western supplies needed to protect the national energy grid are facing severe delays. William Denslow reports from Brussels.
According to Ukrainian officials, Kyiv was targeted by Russian attacks on average every 3 days last month. And the country's President Volodymyr Zelensky has issued a stark warning that Russia is bolstering its missile production ahead of a likely winter campaign to again target Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That is why he says that urgent action is needed from Kyiv's allies, especially amidst this warning from Ukraine that the supply of air defense missiles to counter the threat from ballistic missiles from allies is down by a third in the first half of 2026 compared to last year. In particular, Ukraine needs Patriot defense systems. Now, these are the ones that Ukraine says are best equipped to help counter Russian strikes. However, they are a precious commodity and particularly under strain, considering they are also being used as part of the US-Israel conflict with Iran. Now, assistance is on the way. Here in Europe, a production facility for Patriots is in production in Germany. The European Union also saying that it has this loan of over $100 billion for Ukraine, and it's in constant contact with Kyiv to ensure that it gets the supplies as part of this tranche of cash it needs to help protect itself in any way it sees fit. Also, the United States, crucially, at the Ankara NATO summit in July. President Trump said that Ukraine could have the right to be able to make its own Patriot missiles going forward. He has seemingly, though, walked that back, saying that no final decision has been made. If it is made, it would be a huge boon for Kyiv, and with these supplies from Europe as well, very welcome news indeed. But all of these pledges could indeed take months to fully come to fruition. What Kyiv is saying is that urgent action is needed now to help it protect its skies. William Denslow, Frey News, Brussels.
Now, for more on where the conflict stands, we're joined by Henry Rogers, geopolitical analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Now, July brought Ukraine's heaviest or highest civilian death toll since April 2022. What's behind this sudden uptick in fatalities?
Yeah, this is really important to discuss right now. The reason we're seeing this uptick in fatalities is the same reason that is because of this last month of successes that Kyiv, this last 2 month of successes that Kyiv has had striking Russia, striking targets inland in Russia, including Russian commerce, Russian energy, applying pressure against the Putin government, because the Putin government, of course, projects itself as strong, projects itself as protective of the Russian people, and having long lines at the gas pump, plumes of smoke happening within the Russian mainland from drone attacks, is applying considerable pressure to the Russian government. In turn, the Russians are applying a doctor of pain and pressure. For the greater the successes that Kyiv continues to make within Russian territory, the Russians escalate strikes against civilians, continuing to use these ballistic missiles and wage war within these cities, including Kyiv, and strike and kill civilians. And that's why we're seeing this increase in civilian deaths in tandem with this increase of Ukrainian successes.
Now, speaking about ballistic missiles, Russia is preparing to increase ballistic missile production while Ukraine's interceptor supply has fallen sharply. How serious is that imbalance becoming?
Well, this is really serious because we need to understand that throughout the conflict, Kyiv has struggled when it comes to air defense, especially against ballistic missiles, always suffering a shortage of these US-made Patriot air defenses. These are, of course, the only air defense effective at taking down Russian missiles entirely. And because of that, they've been quite rare, they've been quite rationed. But right now, Kyiv only has about a third of its stockpile that it had last year. A big part of that is, of course, the conflict of the Middle East, taking up missile batteries, taking up missiles themselves. And it's really important to understand that this continued pressure against the Zelensky government, this continued civilian death toll, is taking a toll on the government, taking a toll on the people, and taking a toll on the politics. That can be clearly analyzed from Zelensky's pressure against NATO, the strength of the rhetoric he's using. The rhetoric he's using is quite escalated in its pressure, in its word usage, and because of that, we can derive that these strikes have been successful and the seriousness of these strikes that we're seeing coming out of Russia.
Now let's look at the depleting stockpiles, as you mentioned. Ukraine has asked Washington for more Patriots, but supplies are limited. How should Kyiv rethink air defenses if more interceptors cannot arrive quickly?
Well, look, we've seen NATO step up, if you will, and discuss cutting the red tape, and in the last day discussing bringing interceptors in and supporting Kyiv in this. But Kyiv in the short term is going to have to ration its missile defense interceptors, and it's going to continue to have to use its innovations in the missile defense sector and the drone defense sector that it's been developing. I think we need to understand that Kyiv is, in the long term, Kyiv is going to have to pivot its missile defense, and we've seen the beginning of that in the US agreement by Trump, the discussion of agreement that wasn't fully finalized of Kyiv being able to manufacture and develop its own Patriot missiles and weapons batteries within its own territory. And I believe that's a long-term solution that Kyiv is going to continue to attempt to pivot to, because yes, it's expensive, because yes, it'll take considerable time, but this conflict has continued to become entrenched and bloody. And Kyiv understands that, and Kyiv understands that it's playing for the long term, not the short term, compared to the Russians, who are, of course, continuously trying to play for the short term, continuously trying to earn that easy victory through escalating violence.
Now let's stick on that long-term solution, as you just rightly pointed out. Could the growing missile threat force Ukraine and Europe to rethink its entire architecture of air defenses?
Well, look, when I think it comes to air defense doctrine, air defense thinking, the war in Ukraine has, of course, been revolutionary, has, of course, changed what we know about drones, drone defense, but air defense in general has changed a lot, and it's really important. The Ukrainians, of course, have been pioneering when it comes to ballistic missile defense. On the ground, they're on their brigade level, on their squad level. We're seeing local, decentralized, autonomous missile defense for regions instead of what is traditionally conducted from a high-up military headquarters angle. That is because of the complications with air supremacy that they can't gain. That is because of the complications needing to ration ballistic missile defense and these lack of interceptors. And because of that, Europe and other countries are seriously learning lessons about this. And for the first time, we're seeing that Patriot missiles are going to start being developed in Germany at a plant there. We're seeing continued European investment into local defense, whether that's Rheinmetall in Germany or Renault in France. We're seeing these programs come online, heightened spending, and a considerable amount of that spending is catching up with these ballistic missiles. Because what we've seen in the war in Ukraine is an innovation in offense, the ability to strike and hit targets far easier and with greater ease than the ability to defend and hide.
Yeah.
And because of that, we're going to need these countries realize they need to catch up, and we're going to see that from a local, long-term development within their borders instead of reliant on this former global order.
All right. Briefly and finally, Henry, North Korea is deploying a missile unit inside Russia. How significant is that change in the Russia-North Korea military partnership?
This is very much an evolution of the Russian-North Korean military partnership. The North Koreans out of this gain training for their missile units, and the Russians gain continued use of NK-23s, NK-24 North Korean missiles. These missiles, importantly, are larger and have a larger payload and the ability to strike farther, however, are worse when it comes to hitting pinpointed targets, continuing to show that there's going to be this continued Russian pattern of striking civilians. So when we look at this relationship, it is the natural evolution of both the North Korean-Russian relationship, but it's also the natural evolution of continued Russian pressure against Ukrainian civilians.
All right, that was Henry Rogers, geopolitical analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now, the economic fallout from the war in Ukraine continues to be felt in Central Asia. Uzbek exporters say repeated drone attacks on depots in Russia belonging to the Wild Berries retailer are disrupting the cross-border delivery of goods. Savira Rajapova reports from Tashkent.
Uzbek exporters say repeated drone attacks on Wildberries warehouses and distribution centers in Russia are disrupting deliveries and affecting cross-border trade. Speaking during an open dialogue with the government, several businesses raised concerns over declining exports and delayed shipments. Among them was textile manufacturer Artatex, which employs 300 people and typically exports around $3 million worth of products each year. Deputy Prime Minister Jamshid Khojayev said the government will hold a separate meeting with Wildberries management on Friday. Officials will also review exporters' concerns over outstanding payments and prepare what they described as a long-term solution. According to Reuters, Ukrainian drone strikes have hit at least 20 Wildberries warehouses across Russia since the 18th of July, damaging logistics infrastructure and disrupting operations. The issue is significant for Uzbekistan's exporters. Wildberries says sales of Uzbek-made products on its platform exceeded $1.4 billion in 2025, up from $605 million in 2024 and $418 million in 2023, highlighting the marketplace's growing role as a key export channel for Uzbek businesses. Civil Rajab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan A News.
Kazakhstan's main oil export route is also facing further disruptions. Drone attacks and a lack of tankers are reportedly affecting its main transport route to the Black Sea. Farzai Kalamoziner has more.
Kazakhstan's main oil export route is once again under pressure. According to Reuters, shipments through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium have been disrupted this week by continued drone attacks and the shortage of available tankers. The Black Sea terminal near Novorossiysk has repeatedly suspended and resumed operations in recent days. Sources told Reuters that some cargoes remain on the loading schedule but never make it onto a vessel. In one case, 3 different tankers were assigned to the same shipment before loading was delayed again. Over the past 24 hours, the terminal was temporarily closed twice before reopening, while loading was suspended once more on Wednesday morning. The situation has also been complicated by shipping companies, with many tanker owners refusing to send their vessels into the Black Sea and Russian ports because of the ongoing risk of drone attacks. Kazakhstan's energy ministry says a complete shutdown of the CPC is not being considered, while the consortium itself has declined to comment. The disruptions are already affecting Kazakhstan's oil sector. Reuters reports that the country reduced oil production by 14% in July compared with June, as export bottlenecks through the CPC limited crude shipments. The pipeline remains critical for Kazakhstan, which has no direct access to the sea. More than 80% of the country's oil exports, including crude from the giant Tengiz, Kashagan and Karachaganak fields, are transported through the CPC. Alternative export routes through Georgia and China remain available, but their capacity is limited. As a result, Tengiz Chevroil plans to ship around 100,000 tons of crude by rail to Georgia's Black Sea port of Batumi in August to help offset the ongoing disruptions. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Now, over in Europe, the EU says there has been no illegal onward movement of migrants who arrived in Ceuta during last week's mass crossing. But the Spanish enclave remains in the middle of significant migration crisis, with local services overwhelmed. The influx has fueled humanitarian concerns and political tensions across member states. Here's more.
What has been called Europe's worst border crisis in years, the unprecedented arrivals of migrants from Morocco and other parts of Africa, has left Ceuta reeling.
Today I'm not it's anything, I swear. I don't have the cousin for
Shop owners report shortages of bread and drinking water. Locals either describe the mass crossing as an invasion or work to distribute food and water to those in need.
There's pregnant women, underage girls alone in the streets. We are trying to provide care for them and listen to them, and to try to see what solutions we may provide.
I've taken children to authorities, but they told us no, because everything was so saturated. So many people arrived, it's half a population. The authorities cannot handle this either.
Authorities say around 70,000 people have since returned to Morocco in the following days after arriving, but at least 75 deaths have been reported during the crisis. Migrants said shop closures had left them without food, they encountered hostility from locals, and they were unable to travel on to the Spanish mainland.
The solution is for authorities to enable spaces now where humanitarian assistance can be provided. They've been slow in this regard. If this is being done to create pressure by thinking that migrants will return to Morocco due to the bad living conditions, then we believe this is bad management and a bad decision that violates the Spanish and international regulations on this issue.
The influx has triggered diplomatic tensions between Spain and other EU member states, with Madrid calling for greater solidarity from its partners. Meanwhile, investigations are underway into whether Moroccan authorities deliberately relaxed border controls and whether Spain's intelligence services failed to see the influx coming.
Now, staying in Europe, the effects of the summer's extreme weather continues to be felt. The river Danube is close to its lowest level on record, keeping pressure on energy supplies, shipping and tourism. A weather system moving through Austria could bring some relief, but forecasters say it may not last long. Pablo Guterres reports on Budapest.
Here in Budapest, the Danube is just 9 centimeters above its lowest level ever recorded, a sign of how this drought continues to grip Central Europe. The river has shaped life in this region for centuries. Today, it tells a different story. Sandbanks have broken the surface, cargo vessels carry lighter loads, and many river cruises that have changed their routes or canceled departures. The low water has also become an energy problem. Hungary's Paks nuclear power plant depends on the Danube for cooling. Reduced river flow has forced reactors to cut output, leading the government to ask businesses and households to save electricity during peak hours. Decorative lights on public buildings have gone dark as part of those efforts. There is some hope in the forecast. Rain is expected in parts of Austria, where much of the Danube begins its journey into Central Europe. Water managers say any increase in river levels would take time to move downstream into Hungary, and the amount of rain may not be enough to bring a major recovery. The impact now stretches beyond Hungary. In neighboring Romania, authorities have also launched energy-saving measures. Lights have been switched off at landmarks, and the country works to reduce electricity demand during the drought-driven power shortage. Romania has also reduced nuclear power production because of low Danube water levels. For now, this river remains a measure of the crisis facing the region. Until stronger rainfall reaches the Danube basin, governments, businesses, and residents will keep watching the water and hoping for relief. For A News, Pablo Gutierrez, Budapest, Hungary.
All right, after the break, Georgia suffers its third nationwide blackout in 2 weeks. Opposition groups say sabotage can be ruled out. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now, meanwhile, there's been more power disruptions in Georgia, which has suffered its third nationwide blackout in 2 weeks. Officials blame problems with the testing schedule, but opposition figures say sabotage remains a possibility. Nini Nikolashvili has the details from Tbilisi.
2 weeks ago, Georgia went completely dark, twice back to back. A sabotage case was opened. An investigation was launched with officials saying it was technical issues. Now, for a third time, the entire country blacked out for about an hour. Power and water came back on everywhere yesterday, but a lot of people are wanting to know why it is happening. Georgia's energy regulator, GNERC, says engineers were running scheduled tests at the Angry hydropower plant, which meant briefly operating the grid at a non-standard frequency. They said that move had tripped the whole system. However, Angry HPP only covers about 70% of Georgia's electricity, and the blackout affected the whole country. Opposition leader Ada Davitaye says the silence is telling. After 3 blackouts, an open sabotage case, and 2 weeks of unanswered questions, opposition figures and analysts say that they are not accepting the technical explanation at face value. Analyst Gia Khukhashvili argues that a large part of Georgia's energy system, from transmission lines to distribution companies, is effectively under Russian control, singling out Telesi and Telmiko as examples. He believes that Angry HPP itself is under indirect Russian influence and that the outage may have originated from a deliberate lockdown, potentially triggered from inside Abkhazia. Khukhashvili says this is not random technical failure. He believes it's a message: stay quiet and don't move towards Europe. Officials, meanwhile, still are not offering a final answer. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A News.
In Armenia, a historic power struggle is moving to the courtroom. On Friday, the supreme head of the Armenian Apostolic Church will stand trial on criminal charges. The unprecedented case pits the religious institution against the government.
Catholicos Garagan II and 6 senior clerics are heading to a regional court. They face criminal charges for allegedly obstructing a secular judicial ruling. Defense lawyers strongly condemned the trial, arguing that state intervention violates the constitutional autonomy of the church. The dispute stems from the case of a defrocked bishop, Gevorg Saroyan. The church stripped him of his status for violating his vows. However, Saroyan, who publicly supports Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's policies, sued the church for reinstatement and won in a state court. The church's refusal to comply triggered the current prosecution. Independent analysts suggest the government increasingly views the church as a political threat capable of mobilizing opposition forces. The apostolic leadership is not just a critic. Catholicos Garagan himself has directly called for the Prime Minister to step down over territorial concessions. With the trial taking place in Vakasha Park, the historic spiritual heart of the church, and another prominent cleric currently under house arrest, the courtroom has become the latest battleground in a deeply polarized nation.
Joining me now to discuss this is George Mchadishvili, Associate Professor at the European University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Good to have you. Now, the head of the Apostolic Church now faces trial alongside 6 senior clerics. What is really at stake beyond this particular case?
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, this is a conflict which dates back to 2020. Right after the Second Karabakh War, after which Azerbaijan almost restored in its entirety its territorial integrity. So Catholicos called for resignation of Pashinyan, calling him a traitor and pretty much blaming him for that military loss. Well, it was obvious that the conflict started, then the conflict escalated 1 year later when there was a snap election, and during the snap election something unprecedented happened. The church openly sided with the opposition. Well, previously, church being a very respected, a very significant institution, stayed away from direct political sidings. So yes, you could see between the lines, you could see by the chemistry between the church leaders and certain politicians, like where their preferences lie, but they never directly sided with one part against the other. Obviously, so that was a red line crossed brutally and crossed actually irreversibly, which pretty much signified the war, okay, so the domestic war between the prime minister, because the secular power and the spiritual power in Armenia. Since then, the relations have been escalatingly worsening. So 2024 was another attempt on the part of the church, like to derail current policies of Armenia of rapprochement with Turkey and Azerbaijan. So first and foremost, the Armenian Apostolic Church, well, in his patriarch, in the Catholicos and some other senior leaders, they are vehemently against the current peace process between Armenia and its neighbors, with which they haven't had diplomatic relations, and which have been severely affecting Armenian economy, leading to isolation and over-dependence on Russia. Mm-hmm. So one can read that. So certain Russian interests are also in stake. Garagan II, has been trained, has been educated like in Russia, is believed to be very pro-Russian, have actually even his relative be part of the Moscow, the Russian actually kind of the clerical establishment. Therefore, it is clear that domestic and international issues like are intertwined in this particular regard. So Pashinyan tries to turn this chapter, this bad chapter in the history of Armenia, yes, sort of victory, but the victory which led to the de facto loss of the genuine independence on the part of Armenia. He tries to put back on track the peace processes with Azerbaijan and Turkey, and Russia internationally and domestically, certain political leaders backed by Russia and the church are the political forces which try to derail it. That's the process. Well, I would abstain from going into details. Not that conversant with Armenian constitution, how constitutional, unconstitutional is the current attack. But one can see that the church, it was the church which crossed the line, which actually kind of fires the first shot, direct shot politically 5 years ago when they openly sided with political opposition of Pashinyan, which was actually unprecedented. It was definitely unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pashinyan says the church cannot become a state within a state, while the church says the government is interfering in its autonomy. How should that conflict be judged?
Well, one can say maybe, again, certain moves on the part of Pashinyan are too drastic and of questionable legality. For instance, nationalizing the assets of one of the opposition leaders. This opposition leader is a very unsavory character, openly pro-Russia, but it doesn't mean actually kind of his assets should be taken without any judicial process. So therefore, certain moves are too drastic. One can justify it by the fact that, here Armenia is a situation when it should take drastic moves to extricate itself from Russia and so be able to pursue its peace process with the neighbors and integrate or develop and deepen its relation with the European Union and Western institutions. So the church is the political force which tries to resist it. And therefore, yes, there are certain constitutional complications in terms of legality of certain moves, but again, so I will say on my position, but it was the church which actually so this broke the pact of non-interference.
And finally, sir, Pashinyan was re-elected in June. Does that strengthen his position in confronting an institution that remains deeply rooted in Armenian society?
Sure, it strengthened his hand, but maybe it didn't strengthen it to the extent he wanted because, he won the majority, the simple majority of the parliament, not the constitutional one. So therefore, his hands are, I wouldn't say tied, but his hands are, and his cards, so in the parlance of Donald Trump, are not as strong as he probably wanted them to be. But importantly, it divides society to a certain extent. But maybe it is the move that was due at some point. Again, in the 21st century, so the clerical institution, the church, yes, obviously. Historic roots of the church are very significant. The church is pretty much equated to the entity which brought Christianity to Armenia. Christianity is one of the major pillars of Armenia's identity. Formally, it was the first country which adopted Christianity as state religion more than 1700 years ago. Therefore, yes, there is a significant sentimental value to the church. But unfortunately, the current church leadership abused this sentimental, I would say, power and wanted to directly influence the politics, which is definitely not the right move and the right policy.
Thank you. That was George Mchedishvili, Associate Professor at the European University, joining us from Tbilisi. Thank you for your time, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, and elsewhere in the region, a decades-old conflict may be moving from the battlefield to parliament. Turkey's governing coalition has submitted legislation aimed at advancing the peace process with the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK. The bill would offer limited legal relief to some members and returning militants, but would exclude those convicted of serious crimes. Adam Moro reports from Istanbul.
Turkey's ruling AK party and its main coalition party, the nationalist MHP, have submitted draft legislation to parliament aimed at advancing a peace process with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. If passed, the bill would suspend prison terms for those convicted of PKK membership or of assisting the group in its decades-long armed campaign against the Turkish state. It would also provide legal protection for former militants who were not involved in deadly attacks and who returned to Turkey within 6 months of the legislation's adoption. Senior PKK figures convicted of serious crimes, including the group's jailed leader Abdullah Öcalan, would not benefit from the measures according to the proposed law's terms. Under the legislation, Turkey's National Security Council would verify the group's disarmament, while a committee, including the vice president, cabinet ministers, and the head of intelligence, would oversee the disarmament process. The bill is backed by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AK party, its nationalist ally, the MHP, and the pro-Kurdish Dem party, giving it enough support to pass a parliamentary vote, possibly later this week. The draft legislation follows Öcalan's public appeal last year for the PKK to lay down its arms and dissolve, a call that the group's Iraq-based leadership later endorsed. The PKK is viewed as a terrorist group by Turkey, the United States, and the European Union, and has waged a violent insurgency against the Turkish state since 1984. According to government estimates and international agencies, the conflict has claimed more than 40,000 lives, both civilian and military, and spilled across Turkey's borders into northern Iraq and neighboring Syria. Supporters of the legislation say it could pave the way for a lasting peace and facilitate the return of former militants from northern Iraq. But according to recent opinion polls, many Turks remain skeptical that the move will succeed in ending one of the region's most protracted conflicts. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Now, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan hosted his Syrian counterpart in Ankara today. The ministers held a meeting during which they made a comprehensive assessment of the multifaceted efforts supported by Turkey to establish lasting stability and security in Syria. Following the talks, Fidan strongly condemned Israel's military actions across the region.
İsrail'in Suriye'nin egemenliğini ve toprak
The attacks targeting Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity are among the most serious threats to the country's stability. Israel's continuation of its attacks despite this has once again demonstrated that Netanyahu does not want peace. The Israeli government aims to sabotage peace efforts and uproot Palestinians from Gaza. This objective remains unchanged. We also see that the Netanyahu government is intensifying its acts of terror in the West Bank and Jerusalem.
yoğunlaştırdığını görmekteyiz.
U.S. companies are exploring new investment opportunities in Pakistan's critical minerals sector. The developments come as Islamabad and Washington say negotiations on a bilateral trade framework have advanced significantly. Miriam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Pakistan's critical minerals sector is drawing new U.S. investment interest. On Wednesday, Islamabad said trade negotiations with the United States had advanced significantly. A U.S. embassy official says American companies are exploring investments in smaller mines across the country, while others are considering larger copper projects. The U.S. Export-Import Bank has committed $1.25 billion for the Reko Diq mine in southwestern Balochistan. However, the financing package is yet to be finalized. The officials say mining contributes about 3% to Pakistan's GDP. The Reko Diq project alone could add another 0.5% once operational. Pakistan has commercially viable reserves of copper and other critical minerals used in semiconductors, aircraft manufacturing, and defense industries. With countries racing to secure alternative supply chains, Pakistan's untapped mineral wealth is drawing growing international interest. Mariam Zia, A News, Islamabad.
Meanwhile, Afghanistan is seeking to strengthen its economic ties with neighboring Turkmenistan through a new round of high-level business talks. An Afghan trade delegation is in Ashgabat, where discussions have focused on boosting commerce, investment, and cross-border cooperation. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
Turkmenistan is one of Afghanistan's key regional trading partners because of their shared border. It's also an important route for imports and exports. An economic delegation from Afghanistan's Chamber of Commerce and Investment has traveled to Ashgabat at the official invitation of Turkmenistan's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It says the visit is aimed at expanding economic cooperation between the two neighboring countries. Talks will focus on increasing trade and transit, strengthen cooperation in the oil and gas sector, promote joint investment, improve border infrastructure and remove barriers that affect cross-border commerce. Afghanistan's acting ambassador in Turkmenistan, Fazl Muhammad Sabir, met with members of the business delegation to discuss opportunities for expanding trade relations as well as the challenges facing Afghan traders. According to the Afghan embassy in Ashgabat, Sabir reaffirmed the embassy's commitment to supporting Afghan businesses and facilitating trade. Meanwhile, around 100 Turkmen traders and investors have been invited to Afghanistan. The latest visit underscores ongoing efforts by both countries to deepen economic engagement and improve regional connectivity through stronger commercial partnerships. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, iNews.
All right, that's all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to iNews.